am, but I do
Well,
remember enjoying the event.
great. Well, we certainly enjoyed having you join us. So, and then of course now to have you involved. Welcome to our second keynote on our opening day of the Empowering Learners for the Age of AI conference. I'm just going to do a quick run through a few points. Those of you that were here at the earlier session will have heard or seen this already. Those of you that weren't, well, then you'll hear it now. So one of the intents with this conference, it's been running 3 years now. We've hit our sort of sellout status in terms of the conference, which is outstanding. 1,500 is a great turnout, and we are planning in person next year, as I noted in the morning session. So we're still undecided on where it will be held. If anyone's particularly interested in coordinating with us on holding the event at their local operation, let us know. A big part of what we wanted to do was tackle the hype question, just what's going on, what's practical and what's reality. We also really wanted to look at the AI learning and the learning analytics intersection and what the effect is that might have over time. We're also, for me at least, probably my driving interest is the systemic impacts, is what does AI do to change learning systems? And then just part of forming a global community. One of the things you may have felt if you attended the opening sessions, the conversation is heavily centric to American institutions and researchers. Now, part of that's a time zone thing. We have a growing number of people that'll be picking up the European side going forward and so on. But it's important to see and recognize this is a global discussion, and we want to make sure that we're fostering and promoting that through this organization, Grail. And so there's a URL on the side there if you have any interest in following that in more detail. We have a number of tiers from charter members to our advisory board to our research partners, and we're holding our first in-person event with charter members and the advisory board or scientific committee during the Learning Analytics Conference in Arlington, Texas in March 2023. We see 4 critical areas of research: the infrastructure side, and Daniel really addressed that this morning; the practices end, which was tackled by a number of the discussions and panels we've already had, as well as the skills and literacies, and then the leadership components that come in. Those of you that are interested in being more involved, and I'll start a thread on this in Whova as well. I do a weekly email on just sort of AI learning related trends at that, link to buttondown.email/sales. So since making AI and learning, we have a Learning Analytics Google group that you might be interested in joining as well. And if you have any questions regarding engagement with Grail more formally, Grace Lynch, who's been critical in organizing and pulling this event off, has that information available, so you can get a hold of her if you are interested. Now, why you're actually here. It's a real privilege to be able to introduce Dr. Chris Dede. Those of you who have been involved in the educational technology and innovation space for, let's say since the late 90s, early 2000s, will be very familiar with his work and his name and his profile. And I think we are really delighted to be able to have him involved. He is the senior research fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And for 22 years, he was a Timothy Worth Professor in Learning Technologies. His scholarship work covers a pretty broad field, from emerging technologies to policy, leadership, and related aspects. He's taken on senior leadership roles within Harvard and a related group of areas, such as the chairing the HGSE Department of Teaching and Learning, and also has a fair number of personal initiatives and activities, such as Silver Lining for Learning initiatives. He's a member of the OECD 2030 Scientific Committee, as well as an advisor in a number of future digital learning initiatives and so on. Most consequentially, especially to our conversation here, he's co-principal investigator as well as a co-research lead of the NSF-funded National Institute for artificial intelligence and adult learning and online education. Now, you can do a deeper dive in any of his, quick Google search to find more of his background and publications and so on. But I know we're really pleased and delighted to have Dr. Dede join us today. Over to you.
Well, George, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share ideas. And I also want to thank you and your colleagues for your leadership in putting this conference together and the whole initiative. So I'm going to dive right in because we have a lot to cover, and I am hoping to have some time for discussion afterwards. So hopefully you are seeing slides. So I'm going to talk about IA rather than AI. a concept called intelligence augmentation that I think is actually much more important than pure AI as something that's working by itself. And in the talk, I'm going to spend some time defining intelligence augmentation and giving some examples of it. And then the second part, I'll be looking at what it might mean for education and for society all across the world as IA becomes more and more powerful. But the place to begin is with something that economists call the division of labor, which is what proportion of work is done by people and what proportion of work is done by machines. And of course, ever since hunting and gathering, the percentage of work that's been performed by machines has been rising through the agricultural era, certainly through the industrial era, and now in the digital age. So it's nothing new to say that more and more of work is being done by machines. And the media have been hyping the idea that AI might just be taking over a bunch of jobs, people will be put out of work, that will move completely into the purview of machines. Actually, while there are a few occupations that can be completely automated by AI as it exists now, most cannot. But what's much more important, and what the media aren't talking about very much, is the idea that people will have an artificial intelligence partner in doing their work. And that will actually be true of most jobs, including jobs that we have never thought about historically as being something that we would share with an artificial intelligence. So people are familiar with the concept that if you're working on a manufacturing line, maybe you're sharing the job with robots. But human-centered jobs, that's more a new idea. And yet machine learning and artificial intelligence are now moving to the point that they can share a job role. So what does this complementary sharing of a job role look like? Basically, it's about judgment and reckoning. So some of you may be Star Trek or fans. You may recognize Captain Picard from Star Trek: The Next Generation, the wise human being, and Dede, who looks like a person but is actually a machine, an android. And Dede represents the AI, and in fact his specialty is absorbing and dealing with large amounts of data. So Dede is an advisor to Captain Picard, but you would never want to turn the starship over to Dede. And the reason for that is that Dede does reckoning, but Captain Picard and human beings in general do judgment. So reckoning is calculative prediction, and a non-science fiction example would be a modern oncologist, a cancer specialist, who is working with an AI program. Now, that AI program can do things that no human being can do. It can scan every morning 1,500 online medical journals to see if anything new has been published about the particular kind of cancer that the doctor is looking at in a particular patient. It can also scan all of the online medical records for patients all across the world that may have similar challenges and be receiving a range of treatments for those to see what's happening with them, how they might compare to this particular patient, and how the treatments are going. That's pretty impressive, and it's definitely has the potential to increase the efficacy of cancer care. But you would never want the reckoning system advising the patient, just the doctor. And the reason is that when you're advising the patient, you're dealing not with reckoning, but with human judgment. So healthcare workers know when they're working with cancer patients that some people value quality of life and other people value quantity of life. People have different levels of tolerance for pain. People are facing different kinds of things that might happen to their families both from receiving treatment and also from when they choose to die. People have personal beliefs about death, and those personal beliefs are shaped by cultural beliefs. They also may have spiritual beliefs about life and death. AI does not understand anything under the judgment category. And so the reckoning system falls terribly short of the kind of practical wisdom that's needed when you're advising a patient. So this is sort of the strengths and the weaknesses of AI. AI does some things much, much better than human beings, but it also does other things, really important things, not at all. So why would that be true? Well, there's three kinds of things that human beings have that AI does not have now, and I don't believe will have in my lifetime. And I'm not sure that it will have it in my children's lifetime. And that is, first, that people have bodies. We're biological organisms. And that means that we experience pain, we have mortality, we have senses that help us know and understand the world, and so on. Human beings also are part of a larger social network. We have families, hopefully, and we have cultures that we're part of and societies that we're part of that have rules and laws and so on. None of that makes any sense to AI. It's not only disembodied, but it's isolated. And finally, many people have a spiritual belief or ethical beliefs about what's right and wrong. And again, this is not something that AI has or can really understand in any way. So what I'm trying to convey is that AI is not a machine intelligence that over time, as it becomes more powerful, is more and more like a human intelligence. That is not the case, even though there are people in AI who would make claims about that. Instead, AI is an alien intelligence that is more alien than anything that we will encounter on this earth. So IA says, okay, if you have a machine and a human being, and it's a partnership in which the machine does the reckoning, but the people are in charge and they get to focus on judgment and decision making, that's a desirable situation because you're playing to the strength of each side in the complementary partnership. Now, I said earlier that we're looking at jobs that people have not thought about as having an AI partner. I am a co-PI and the Associate Director for Research in one of the 18 national AI institutes that the National Science Foundation in the US has funded so far. And our particular institute is on adult learning and online education. So it's really about workforce capacity building. And one of the things that my colleagues and I are doing in the Institute is we're developing AI assistants for university professors. So I am, in fact, in a job where parts of my job are going to be taken away and given to artificial intelligence assistants. Now, these are narrow but powerful because AI has a kind of intelligence that's necessarily narrow. It's not broad like human intelligence. So there's a TA that specializes in answering questions. There are TAs that pick particular kinds of content that some students don't master, even with good regular instruction, and so they need special support that the tutor provides. There are laboratory assistants, there's library assistants, there's assessment assistants, there's even a social assistant that's being developed that in a large class helps students find other students who might be good learning partners for them or who might form a good study group together. So what happens to me? Well, if I simply continue to do what I've always done, but turn parts of it over to the AI, because they're going to do a bunch of routine work for me, then I'm de-skilled. And in fact, I end up to some extent working for the AI because the TA for question answering will say, well, here's a question I can't answer, so you do it. Or I can upskill. I can increase my judgment, my connection with students, my understanding of their specific cultural background, their understanding of their demographic characteristics and perhaps neurodiversity that they bring. And so I become more effective because while I've turned over part of the job to reckoning machines that do that part of the job perfectly well, I'm extending what I can do because they've taken over that part of the work. So that's intelligence augmentation. But it only works if people are capable of upskilling and deepening their judgment activities. If they don't bother to upskill, or if they upskill, but they upskill in a way that doesn't really increase their knowledge and their judgment towards practical wisdom, then it's not going to have a happy ending when AI and humans partner together. So for example, if I just said, well, I'm going to deepen my content knowledge, I'm going to become even more of a content expert, that doesn't really speak to judgment. In fact, that's a kind of thing that AI probably would be used in terms of reckoning deeper content knowledge. So how are we doing on this concept of human beings develop judgment? This is a shift in the kind of educational outcomes that we want. And in fact, we're going in the wrong direction with the kind of educational outcomes that we promote, because what we measure the effectiveness of education by at every level is high-stakes psychometric, summative, drive-by tests. And that's true whether you're in fourth grade or trying to get into a university or trying to get into graduate school, or if a country is trying to raise itself in the education rankings. And those tests measure reckoning. They measure what AI does well. So we're preparing students to lose to AI as opposed to preparing them to deepen their judgment so that they can do reckoning. Not only are the psychometric items on those tests reckoning, and it's not surprising that they are, because psychometrics is a formulaic discipline, and you're learning different kinds of formulaic knowledge, which means that it can be reduced to something that an algorithm can do. But also parts of the test, like the writing sample, now are coming under the purview of AI, because descriptive writing is formulaic. If you've ever tried to prepare for one of the essays on the high stakes tests, you know that you can be taught a recipe for how to construct that essay. And now there's a great deal of wringing of hands about, oh my goodness, computers can do writing. Students are going to cheat because when they're asked to do descriptive writing, they'll just use an AI instead. And by the way, this is also happening with formulaic art. But what this simply means is that in addition to whatever benefit we gain from psychometric tests that measure reckoning, and reckoning is still a part of human beings, we don't want data to be magic. We don't want us to have no idea of what data is doing. But to deepen reckoning in education just doesn't make any sense. And to give assignments that involve descriptive writing doesn't make any sense. I'll talk more about what does make sense later. Now, if these ideas are interesting to you and you'd like to go deeper with them, I'm also part of a group at the Harvard Graduate School of Education called the Next Level Lab, which applies cognitive science, learning sciences, and neuroscience to learning and workforce development. And we've written a series of briefs. And one of those briefs that I've co-authored with two of my former students is about intelligence augmentation. And so it's a good next step if you're interested in going deeper with this concept. So now I'm going to switch to part two and say, well, what do we do about this? If you believe in IA, and I think I'm making a good case for why you should, what should we do to shift towards judgment so that we can upskill and get the benefits of the partnership? And of course, there's different theories about that. In 2017, a British think tank, Nesta, sponsored by Pearson, did a report on the future of skills in 2030. And that report really emphasizes the cognitive side of skills. But you can see that a lot of these skills are not formulaic. They're not something that an algorithm can do. And in fact, just as with the cancer patient, they involve significant things that embodied social and ethical reasoning are part of. The same year, the OECD released its sense of skills in 2030. And the two are very interesting because the OECD does not primarily focus on the cognitive, although some of it is there. It focuses more on the ethical and the social and the ability to interact with human beings and to work collectively together and to value diversity. So it's a great match when you fit the two halves together in terms of what these skills might look like. Now that was 2017. How has the pandemic affected some of this? Well, I was interested over a year ago to see an article in the United States that talked about a survey that had been done of employers about what they considered to be basic skills in the workforce. And by basic skills, I mean what you would expect of an entry-level worker in some kind of a business. This is the first job that they're holding. And some of these skills are not surprising. Communication, certainly, is something that you need as an entry-level worker. But leadership, complex thinking, these, I think, are byproducts of the pandemic. Because what happened in the pandemic is that command and control systems broke down. And people who didn't have any innovation, didn't have any leadership, didn't have any flexibility and creativity, were paralyzed by the pandemic. They didn't know what to do because their bosses didn't know what to do. But people who had innate leadership and problem solving and complex thinking could take authority and responsibility for making their part of work possible. So the pandemic actually helped with this idea of pushing towards judgment rather than just focusing on reckoning, even for entry-level workers. Now, coupled with this and building on this idea that we really need judgment skills is that we got to get beyond psychometric tests. And one way to do that is to have diagnostic learning by doing activities where you attempt something, such as the ecosystems curricula that we designed at Harvard, where students enter a virtual ecosystem, wear the shoes of an ecosystem scientist, use inquiry to try to figure out what's going on, and they get their progress through the world is tracked. That's diagnostic, and then they get formative feedback directly from the curriculum and also from the teacher. So it's a model of coaching rather than a model of instruction, something that I'll talk again more about later. And similarly, instead of taking a psychometric test at the end of everything, to figure out what you know and you don't know, micro-credentials are a way of developing an ongoing record of accomplishment that can be diagnostic and formative, that doesn't have to be psychometric. And the Silver Lining for Learning series that George referenced in his introduction is something that we started during the pandemic, my co-hosts and I, the very first week of the pandemic. We're now up to episode 131. And in episode 124, we talked with some experts about micro-credentials. So beyond looking at Silver Lining for Learning in general to see if there are other episodes that might be interesting, this would be a good episode to look at if you're wondering what we complement high-stakes summative assessments with. So how are elite universities responding to this? Well, many universities are being quite traditional, including, I would have to say, Harvard, but others are taking a more forward-looking perspective. One of the things that they're discussing is that instead of declaring a major or a role, which seems more like a reckoning-oriented approach, you declare a purpose, and then you're building skills and competencies based on the purpose rather than going through disciplinary topics based on the major. So my younger daughter just graduated as a mechanical engineer, and she declared that as her major because she had to declare a major. Her passion is to help people in marginalized groups to have a better life through engineering. But that's a broader thing than just majoring in engineering. And so having a purpose and declaring the purpose is a powerful way of orienting classes, evaluations, and so on towards competencies. And hopefully this is where not just elite universities, but higher education in general will move. And again, there's some Silver Lining for Learning episodes that talk about this. So there are strategies that we can use to get beyond this problem of educating for the wrong outcomes. So lifelong learning is going to have to be on the table, though. We're not just entering a world of intelligence augmentation, disrupting society. We're going to be faced with many other disruptions: climate change, failure to reach the UN sustainability goals, disruption from other technologies beyond just artificial intelligence. And so people are not going to spend all of their lives paying money to organizations to provide them with structured education. They're going to need a lot of expertise in self-directed learning, which is also something that we work on in the Next Level Lab, and that there are briefs on that we are available to you if you want to look at how to make students agile, self-directed learners. I'm an advisor to a grant funded by the US Department of Education on how to use post-secondary teaching to help make people self-directed learners. In particular, to help students attain skills that cannot be taught, but can be learned. And if you're curious about that, I would urge you to take a look at the work of this collaborative and to the little kind of essay I wrote about helping with self-directed learning. So one other theme that I wanted to bring out that actually speaks both to AI reckoning and to human judgment is engineering learning. It's called learning engineering because Herb Simon, who developed the concept over half a century ago, called it that. But that's confusing because you're not learning the field of engineering. You're learning how to engineer the process of learning. And in 2019, I was one of the editors of a book on learning engineering that was sort of an early pioneering book in the field. And then this past year, in 2022, a book came out that was primarily authored by other people. I happened to write the foreword for it, The Learning Engineering Toolkit. It's a terrific book and not very expensive, and I urge everyone to take a look at it because it is a toolkit for helping us do what I'm advocating to help people learn judgment. And the difference between learning engineering and the learning sciences is just like the difference between science and engineering. You can be a terrific physicist, but that doesn't mean that you are going to know how to build a bridge. So engineering is the practical application against substantial difficulties in the real world of scientific principles. And the learning sciences have a bunch of scientific principles now. This is a list that Professor Janet Kolodner generated as part of a conference on engineering learning that was held last summer. But then engineering says, how do we apply these? So if you're helping learners to understand new ideas, that's one set of principles from the learning sciences. But if you're helping them to apply the knowledge that they've gained, that's a different set. And if you're helping them to transfer the learning or to motivate them to want to learn, those are other principles. So the engineering of learning involves taking the sciences, but understanding when and how to apply them. So now I can talk just a little bit about this National AI Institute that I'm part of on adult learning and online education. And I've already described the instructional assistants that are being developed there that were going to surround me eventually. I'm more interested in learning by doing. And so I see also AI-powered immersive virtual simulations that both have embedded coaching and that have a human coach and mentor helping with what goes on. And in something like this, there's AI at both ends. There's AI at the front end to make the simulation very rich and authentic and complex. And there's AI at the back end to understand second by second what the learner is doing and feed back that into both the human coach and the AI assistant and the learners. So there are three sets of things getting feedback, and all of them are interwoven together. Now, to illustrate this, I'll just briefly describe digital puppeteering and a company called Mersion that is one of the companies that does digital puppeteering. Full disclosure, I am an advisor to Mersion. I have a small equity stake in Mersion, but I'm excited about Mersion because I think digital puppeteering is a very powerful concept. It's basically like the Wizard of Oz on steroids. So in the Wizard of Oz, there's the great big virtual wizard up on the screen, but there's a little man behind the curtain that's controlling the wizard. In systems like Mersion, there's a simulation specialist shown on the left that can play up to 5 or 6 or 7 virtual people, avatars, simultaneously using a lot of specialized hardware and software. And on the right, you see the learner who might be thousands of miles away, looking at a screen on which there are these virtual people that the simulation specialist is playing that all are different. And the learner is practicing a skill. So one way of seeing this is that it's like a flight simulator for human skills. We know how to build systems like the ecosystem science system, where we simulate an ecosystem, or the flight simulator, where we simulate an airplane. Now we can also simulate interactions with people. And the reason we can do that is not because AI is playing the people. AI can't play the people well. It's because a human being is playing the people with an AI partner. Now, if you're the human simulation specialist, this is an example of the kind of dashboard that you would see. You see the people that you are playing on the upper left. You see the learner in the middle, and you're getting full bandwidth through the webcam, so you're able to get the nonverbals that the learner is displaying, as well as whatever verbal interactions they have. And then you have this elaborate dashboard where second by second different kinds of data are being collected, some of them so that the simulation specialist can modify what they're doing depending on what physiological responses they're seeing from the learner, and some of them because machine learning take this data that's flowing back to it, find patterns, draw conclusions, and feed those back. Now, my colleague Rhonda Bondi and I are among many researchers who are using immersion to help with teacher capacity building, both pre-service and in-service. And Rhonda and I have done some fairly elaborate work with literally thousands of teachers using immersion in repeated cycles to try to help them develop the ability to hold equitable classroom discussions with agile responses in real time. This is quite a complex skill, and if you'd like to know more about our work with that, you can find publications about it. But what we find is that this kind of mixed reality, professional, immersive simulation with AI at both ends is something that learners really enjoy and appreciate. Not just teachers. I've also worked with the Harvard Business School, the Harvard Law School, and some other groups that teach negotiation, because negotiation is something else that lends itself well to this kind of flight simulator for human skills. Overall, if we step back and look at what this may mean for our understanding of learning, I'm reminded of the microscope and the telescope. Both of these devices measure data that's effectively invisible. For a long time, we didn't know it was there. When we figured out it was there, we didn't know how to collect it. When we collected it, we didn't know how to analyze it. And when we finally figured all of that out, it changed everything. The microscope gave us disease theory. The telescope is giving us new insights about the universe. We now have in IA the equivalent of the microscope and the telescope for learning. And I expect equally transformational insights to emerge as we start with our AI partners to interpret the very, very rich data streams that come out of online education in particular, and even more that come out of immersive virtual performance simulations of different kinds. And all of this, it seems to me, is to work towards personalization. Personalization, in the strong way that I'm using it, has a lot of learner agency in it. It's not just adapting instruction to a learner. It's not just individualizing to one particular person in terms of what they know and don't know. It's voice and choice and learner agency in determining what, how, when, and why they're learning. And all of these tools and approaches that I've been describing, ultimately, it seems to me, can lead to personalization. And that's where true equity and diversity is going to come, is when we really personalize to each individual, no matter what they bring to the table, to help them learn in an effective way. So I'm going to make a prediction for about a decade from now, and if I'm still around and I was wrong, you can come harass me about it. But I'm going to claim in the next decade that there are three big shifts that are going to take place in society. The first shift is that we're going to be able to do evidence-based modeling for some decisions. That is, like the cancer doctor, like the university professor surrounded by IA assistants, like the immersion simulation specialist, we're going to be able to model complex things and make judgments based on those models. However, AI is going to be good at predicting natural phenomena, where you can rely on data and basically the laws of the universe to be predictable. But it's going to be very limited or even useless in forecasting human-controlled phenomena. So if I do a what-if question and I say, what might happen, how much of Boston would be flooded if the global temperature goes up 2 degrees centigrade by the year 2050? That would be a what if that could be done with evidence-based modeling by AI, even if no one had ever done a study, even if the AI were the first thing to try to answer that question. But if I were to ask the AI, and when will human beings decide to do something about this, it doesn't have a clue, because human-controlled phenomena are not necessarily rational. The second prediction is that there's going to be a higher threshold for human creation. And writing and formulaic art are two examples. We should stop giving students assignments to do descriptive writing, except maybe once or twice, so they understand where it comes from. And instead, we should say, use the AI to get the descriptive essay and then turn it into a narrative, turn it into a story, turn it into a compelling op-ed, turn it into something that makes people happy or sad. That's the human side. Similarly with art, sure, use AI to make formulaic art, but then go ahead and differentiate it in a way that AI never can, so that the characters come alive within the art. So human creation will change, and with IA, it becomes a higher threshold, better outcomes. And then finally, a better understanding of the self and others, because these AI-enhanced simulations don't have to be limited to learning skills like effective classroom discussion or using it for learning negotiation. It also can be used to help with empathy, to help with your ability to do perspective taking, to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and see the world from their perspective, because you're embodied as somebody else. This gets beyond AI into immersion as well, which is another field that I study. So my optimistic feeling is that if we can change education so that we're not just deepening reckoning, but we're going towards improving judgment, and we shift into getting away from teaching people reckoning to do what if questions, to understanding what questions to ask, getting away from doing descriptive writing and formulating art to improving on those, and looking at issues of human personalization and cultural differences and respect for others as the foundation, then we're going to have a better world. So I want to leave time for discussion, so I'm going to close by talking about a book that I co-edited that was published in 2020. It was actually written before the pandemic. The pandemic was not anticipated in the book, but the book did anticipate a very turbulent future for the next half century, in which the pandemic is just the tip of the iceberg, and new models for lifelong learning that are needed, continuous lifelong learning. The point I want to make is that one of the most fundamental things that we should do all the time is to ask, what business are we in? No matter what role you're playing, you should be asking, what business are we in? I live about 100 miles north of a town called Newport, Rhode Island, and in Newport, over a century ago, mansions, incredibly opulent mansions, were built by very wealthy people who had made their fortunes partly in finance, but mainly in the railroads. And they lived like kings and queens in what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. But within 20 years, those fortunes had collapsed. Those mansions fell into disarray. Many were torn down. Now a few were left as museums. What happened? What happened is those folks did not understand what business they were in. They thought they were in the railroad business, but they were actually in the transportation business. And the automobile and the airplanes hammered the railroads. We are not in the education business anymore. We're not in the classroom business, the campus business, the school business, the degree business, the high stakes test business, none of that. We are in the learning business. And that is a very different business than the education business, one that I'm trying to sketch in this talk. And I'm sure that others will be sketching in the rest of the conference. And we need to develop our knowledge and skills and our dispositions, because it is going to be an incredibly turbulent time if we're going to have a good future. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I hope that we can have a few minutes for whatever you want to ask or say about this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chris. You've got a lot of comments going on that I'm sure you might have seen on your desktop, so it's hard to kind of track what's gone on, but certainly your comments have strongly resonated with the audience as well. And I think we're very fortunate as a group to have had an outstanding kickoff keynote from Danielle, outstanding keynote from you that situates a lot of the intersection between the two. So one of the things that was interesting in the 1950s, an individual wrote what's called Fitts List. And Fitts List was early stages of trying to get an understanding of where does AI do, what does a human being do? And we're still having that conversation at a very complex level now, right? Because AI has moved in ways that's now doing things that actually it couldn't do before. Generative AI, which is probably the AI theme of 2022, is producing really complex kinds of examples. It might not know or understand, but it can win art competitions and it can win writing competitions. And so I'm wondering, when you see that landscape, and this is the idea of functional task analysis, which is the underpinning statement of Fitts model. And so I'm just curious to hear from your perspective, if you're looking going forward, the 60-year curriculum, the emphasis that you have in your work around, finding your purpose and so on. If you were to advise, say, an educator now to plan going forward in the field, what kinds of skills do you think they would need as a teacher or as a professor or as a corporate trainer in order to help people navigate this intersection that's a little unclear?
I've wrestled with this throughout my career, of course, because as someone in the School of Education, my primary work with adult learning has been looking at how educators learn and how I can help them learn and help myself learn as an educator. And one of the things that is fundamental is that teachers teach as they're taught, and that people don't do what you say, they do what you model. And so giving lectures about the importance of learning by doing is kind of a doomed activity from the beginning. So one of the most important things I think that needs to happen with educating the people that educate educators like myself is to experience some of the things that I described in the talk, to experience what it's like to have an AI partner and where the AI partner works well and where the AI partner is useless or worse than useless. Another piece of it is if you're going to use virtual performance simulations to develop skills, as Rhonda and I and many others have done, then you should yourself experience the virtual performance simulations and see their strengths and weaknesses and understand what good mentoring and coaching looks like, as opposed to good standing on the stage and delivering looks like. So walking the talk is one fundamental aspect that I think is just central to making the kind of shift that we're making. Another is getting past the high stakes tests. If I had a magic wand and I could wave it and change one thing, it would be measuring the outcomes of education by high stakes summative tests, because while they have their strengths, at this point in human history, they have many more weaknesses than they have strengths. and longitudinal diagnostic formative trajectories of competence over time are a better measure of judgment than anything that we can put together in the very best summative psychometric exams. So that's a second kind of fundamental change that I think would need to take place to make progress.
That's great points there. If you were then to say, from the current perspective of these really fascinating technologies, and I just asked a question there around people who've been playing around with Chat GPT, and what surprised me with it is there's people who, one person had a funny comment today, said, well, for all of you that were thinking that Tesla trucks would lose 1 million jobs by 2020, they're now commenting that Chat GPT is AGI, it's artificial general intelligence, which, in many ways, clearly it's not. But there is, I think, a sense for many people seeing something that almost feels like it's interesting, like it feels like it's something big and it's a big consequential shift, which some of the new tools appear to be approaching that level of performance. But then you raised a really interesting point, and that back ends the comment you just made. What is it that we need to, or if we can change the system? And that's a tough one, I think. And as Chris in the comments noted, that's too big. Like it's a big challenge. But the reality is, it is about that. Like if there are things that we can do better with AI, but we're still teaching curriculum like AI doesn't exist. We're still focusing on a memory-oriented view of learning, rather than a being-oriented view of learning. We're still teaching concepts, facts, and things that they can easily discover on their own. You've been in this space for a very long time. Why have we not seen these broad-scale systems changes that we hear about?
Well, it is interesting why education is more resistant to change than any other sector of society. That, the only thing that Rip Van Winkle would feel familiar with waking up after a couple centuries of sleep is the educational system. Everything else would look just incredibly different. And that's odd because education is actually our mechanism for addressing the future. If there's any sector of society that needs to be forward-looking, it's how you prepare young people for a world 20 or 30 years hence. You have to really anticipate the future and understand where things are going. So the very sector in society that's most important to be forward-looking is incredibly backward-looking. And I have struggled to understand that. I think that one of the problems is that everybody thinks that they understand education, and that I grew up, I went to a traditional school, I succeeded, so my kids can do the same thing. Why would you want to spend 2 weeks teaching something by doing when you can spend 20 minutes teaching it by telling? Lots and lots of misconceptions of different kinds. And medicine has done a much better job of talking people out of the age of leeches and, humors and all of the things that aren't scientific that dominated the field of medicine than we have in education, talking people out of their profound misconceptions about learning. So I think, again, it's a matter of lifelong learning, where if you really are attempting to learn something new every day, then you're exposing yourself to new ideas about learning and new processes for learning. Whereas if you finish with an education, but you hate learning because your education was so awful as a process, then you sort of shut the door and just view it as kind of a hazing that everybody has to go through in order to get a job, then we're not going to see profound changes.
Yeah, and I keep thinking, it just from my own perspective, that the critical work of education innovation isn't currently the adaptation and inclusion of new technologies, new tools, new pedagogies. I think the critical issue going forward is a systems change issue. Now, the problem is systems change is bigger than a president of a university. It's bigger than a prof and a faculty. It's bigger than a single politician. So you can't re-engineer a system from a top-down approach, but it does raise concerns for me that I do think the biggest missing gap right now is a system structure gap. There's a good question
Well,
that oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'll just say something quick and then we can do one other question. I see really three mechanisms for change. There's evolutionary change, where you take the system and try to change it by 10% every year. And that's what most of us spend most of our time doing. And it fails because when the system wakes up and realizes it's 20% changed, all of the negative feedback loops go to work and kill the innovation. There's transformative change, where you maybe have the power to change the system by about 50%, all in one fell swoop. And then there's a war between the old system and the new system, and it's pretty bloody, and sometimes one wins and sometimes another. And then there's disruptive change, what my late colleague Clay Christensen talked about when he said you build something off to the side, not even in the system, that's serving the needs of people who are not well served by the system. You get better and better and better and better, and all of a sudden people vote with their feet, and the old system collapses and the new system takes over. That's hard to do in K-12 education because it's not a market system, but it isn't so hard to do in higher education. And I think that the idea of disruptive systems and starting that by seeing the business as learning rather than education is maybe one way forward.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, I'm going to ask just one question because I started it, and then I right at the very end, Vanessa asked a question here around, how do we control these AI tools that are detrimental to learning? And a quick point on that. Sometimes we look at what's easy for a system to do. Well, some of the easier things for an AI system or a predictive system or a nudging learning analytics system to do is to provide guidance, like, George, set your goals. George, go here. George, go do that. And if I just follow the processes, I'm actually sacrificing my metacognitive capabilities because I'm offloading a lot of those functions to the system. If I offload metacognitive capabilities, I'm actually hampering the one core human trait that I need in the future going forward, which was addressed in the earlier part of your talk. So I think it's a great question. How do we control those AI technologies that are detrimental?
I agree with your framing of the question, and I agree that those are easily can become detrimental. What technology can do is to be a prosthesis for us, an external memory, an external superego, an external timekeeper and nudger and executive function provider and so on. But the important thing about a prosthesis is that you use it temporarily, you build up your own capacity, and then you throw the crutch away. You throw the wheelchair away. You don't become a cyborg. And the whole concept of the cyborg in science fiction is so clever because it's portrayed as an evil thing, and it is an evil thing because you're giving up the parts that make you most human in this sort of Faustian bargain with being able to get some temporary advantage by filling in your shortcomings and your weaknesses. So those systems are a great place to start, but if they're not treated as something that you use, grow beyond, and leave behind, then, as you say, it doesn't have a happy ending.
Yeah, fantastic point. So, well, we've got wall to wall. We've got many panels coming up. As those of you are aware, if you're in HUVA, we have coming up next. There's early career and learning researchers coming. We have AI Playground panel coming in a few hours' time. Sense AI, which is a global research study around AI and learning, AI in education, and the list goes on and on and on. So we have a European angle. So I hope you stick around and attend. It's been a fantastic event so far. Stop by discussions in HUVA. Dr. Dede, thanks for a fantastic keynote, and all the best.
Thanks for coming. Look forward to all of us working together for a better future.
Thank you.